Tennessee, 1865. Aunt Litty poisoned. Guan. Soldiers with glasses of water who took her husband to war. The most devastating act of hospitality turned to vengeance in American history, and the most chilling demonstration that the gentlest gestures can conceal the deadliest intentions. When an elderly mountain woman used the sacred tradition of offering water to travelers as the instrument of her revenge against the soldiers who had taken her husband to a war he did not survive. This is the true story of Aunt Litty. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Cocky County, Tennessee, in the final months of the Civil War, in a hollow so isolated that the great conflict that had torn the nation apart had touched it only through the men it had taken and the grief it had left behind. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and ancient rock, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before Tennessee was a state, who had never owned slaves and had no stake in the war that was supposedly being fought over slavery, who wanted only to be left alone by both armies and by the governments that directed them. You see, in Cock County during the years of our story, the Civil War was not a noble crusade for either Union or Confederacy, but was a catastrophe that had descended upon mountain people who wanted no part of it. The hollows of East Tennessee were divided in their loyalties, some families supporting the Union and others the Confederacy, but most simply wanted to survive a conflict that made no sense to people whose lives had never depended on the slave economy that the war was supposedly about. The armies that swept through the region cared nothing for these distinctions, conscripting men from both sides, taking whatever food and livestock they could find, treating the mountain people as resources to be exploited rather than citizens to be protected. The woman at the center of our story was known throughout the Tennessee mountains simply as Aunt Litty, though her given name was Letitia Whaley, and she had been born Letitia May Combs in 1798 in a cabin on the upper reaches of Cosby Creek. She had married Ezekiel Whaley when she was 18, had borne him 9 children of whom 7 survived to adulthood, had spent 47 years building a life with a man she loved, and had watched that life destroyed in a single afternoon when soldiers came to take him away to a war that would kill him. That's right. Aunt Litty was 67 years old in the spring of 1865, a small woman whose body had been bent by decades of mountain labor, but whose mind remained sharp as the blade of the knife she used to prepare her herbs, whose eyes retained a clarity that observers found unsettling, a watchfulness that suggested she saw everything and forgot nothing. She had white hair that she kept covered with a bonnet in the old style, hands that were gnarled from arthritis, but still capable of the work that survival required, a voice that had grown soft with age, but that could still carry a curse that made strong men flinch. Her reputation in the community was that of a healer and a saint, a woman who had spent decades caring for the sick and the dying, who had never turned away anyone who came to her door seeking help, who had earned through a lifetime of service a respect that bordered on reverence. She knew the herbs that healed and the roots that cured, had delivered more babies than any physician in the county, had sat with more dying people than the preachers who were supposed to provide comfort in the final hours. The mountain people called her aunt, not because she was related to them, but because the title conveyed the respect they felt for an elder who had devoted her life to their welfare. The cabin where she lived stood beside the road that connected the mountain communities to the broader world, a location that her husband had chosen decades before because it provided access to the travelers and traders who were the mountain economy's connection to markets beyond the hollows. The location had served them well in peacetime, had allowed Ezekiel to sell the products of their farm, and Litty to offer her healing services to travelers who passed through. But the same accessibility that had been an advantage in peace became a curse in war, as the cabin's position on the road made it impossible to avoid the soldiers who moved through the region, taking whatever they wanted. The tradition of hospitality that characterized mountain culture required that travelers be offered food and drink, that the basic necessities of the road be provided to anyone who asked, that the obligations of host to guest be honored regardless of the guest's identity or purpose. This tradition was so deeply embedded in mountain society that violating it was unthinkable, a betrayal of values that had sustained the community through generations of hardship. Aunt Litty had honored this tradition throughout her life, had offered water and food to countless travelers, had never refused anyone who came to her door in need. The soldiers who came for Ezekiel Whaley arrived on the afternoon of August 14, 1863, a detachment of Union cavalry, under orders to conscript men for service regardless of their age or inclination. The Conscription Act of 1863 had given the federal government authority to draft men between the ages of 20 and 45, but the soldiers who enforced it in the mountain regions interpreted their orders liberally, taking men who were older or younger than the law specified, ignoring the exemptions that the law provided, treating conscription as an opportunity for the kind of casual brutality that war makes routine. Ezekiel Whaley was 65 years old when the soldiers came for him, 2 decades beyond the age that the law specified, too old for the rigors of military service, and too valuable to his community to be spared. He had white hair and a body weakened by the labor of farming marginal land for 47 years, could not have marched the distances that soldiers were required to march, or performed the duties that military service demanded. But the soldiers did not care about the law or about the obvious unsuitability of the man they were taking. They had quotas to meet, and Ezekiel Whaley would fill a space on their roster, regardless of whether he could actually serve. The scene that unfolded that August afternoon would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it, neighbors who had gathered when they saw the soldiers approaching, family members who had come running when word spread of what was happening. Ezekiel had been working in the garden behind the cabin when the soldiers arrived, had come around the house when he heard the commotion, had found himself surrounded by armed men before he understood what was happening. "Ezekiel Whaley," Sergeant Crawford called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You are hereby conscripted into the service of the United States Army. You will come with us immediately." Ezekiel's response was calm, the product of a lifetime of dealing with difficult situations without panic. "I am 65 years old, Sergeant. The law does not require men of my age to serve." Crawford laughed, a sound without humor that made clear his contempt for both the objection and the man making it. "The law requires whatever we say it requires, old man. You can walk to the wagon or you can be carried. The choice is yours." Litty had emerged from the cabin by then, had seen her husband surrounded by soldiers, had understood immediately what was happening. She pushed through the ring of armed men, placed herself between Ezekiel and the sergeant, her small body somehow seeming larger in her determination to protect the man she had loved for 47 years. "He is too old," she said, her voice carrying a firmness that surprised even those who knew her well. "He cannot serve. He will die if you take him." "Then he will die serving his country," Crawford replied, "which is more than most of you mountain trash will ever do." The insult hung in the air, the contempt so naked that even the soldiers seemed uncomfortable with it, but none of them objected. None of them suggested that perhaps the sergeant was going too far. None of them acknowledged that the woman standing before them was defending her husband with the only weapons she possessed. The soldiers seized Ezekiel despite Litty's protests, despite her attempts to hold on to him, despite her screams that brought neighbors running, but that could not prevent what was happening. They dragged him to the wagon where other conscripts already sat, men taken from other cabins and other hollows, their faces showing the same mixture of fear and resignation that Ezekiel's face showed. Litty followed the wagon as far as she could, walking beside it as it moved down the road, calling out to Ezekiel until the soldiers ordered her to stop, until the wagon disappeared around a bend and she was left standing in the road with nothing but the dust it had raised and the knowledge that she might never see her husband again. Aunt Litty watched as the soldiers took her husband, watched as they ignored her pleas and her explanations that he was too old for service, watched as they dragged him away from the cabin where they had spent 47 years together and loaded him onto a wagon that would carry him to a war he had never supported and would not survive. She stood in the doorway of the cabin they had built with their own hands, her face showing an expression that the neighbors who witnessed the scene would never forget, a stillness that contained something more terrible than any display of grief could have conveyed. The soldiers who took Ezekiel numbered 21 men, a detachment large enough to discourage resistance and small enough to move quickly through the mountain terrain. They were under the command of a sergeant named Vernon Crawford, a man whose approach to conscription reflected a contempt for the mountain people that he made no effort to hide. Crawford had been raised in the lowland regions of the state, had absorbed the prejudices that flatland people held against their mountain neighbors, viewed the conscription raids as opportunities to humiliate people he considered inferior. The 21 men who served under Crawford shared their sergeant's attitudes to varying degrees. Some were merely indifferent to the suffering they caused, focused on completing their mission and collecting the bonuses that successful conscription brought. Others actively enjoyed the power that their uniforms gave them, the ability to enter any home and take any man, the knowledge that the mountain people could not resist them without facing consequences far worse than conscription. A few were troubled by what they were doing, but lacked the courage to object, their silence making them complicit in actions they knew were wrong. Ezekiel Whaley died 6 months after his conscription, in February of 1864, at a military hospital in Nashville, where he had been sent after contracting pneumonia during the winter campaign. He had never fired a shot in the war, had never performed any meaningful military service, had simply been worked and marched until his elderly body could no longer sustain the demands being placed upon it. His death was recorded in the official records as occurring in the line of duty, a notation that would have been bitterly ironic to anyone who understood the circumstances of his service. The details of Ezekiel's final months emerged gradually, pieced together from the accounts of other conscripts who had served with him, and who eventually made their way back to the mountains. He had been assigned to a labor battalion, his age making him unsuitable for combat duty, but not excusing him from the war's demands entirely. He had dug fortifications and hauled supplies, and performed the countless tasks that armies required, his body breaking down under burdens that would have challenged men half his age. The other conscripts described how Ezekiel had tried to maintain his dignity, despite everything, how he had refused to complain, even as the work destroyed him, how he had spoken of Litty constantly and counted the days until he might see her again. He had kept a small carving that she had given him years before, a wooden bird that he touched whenever the despair threatened to overwhelm him, a connection to the life he had been taken from and hoped to return to. The pneumonia that killed him was almost inevitable given his age and the conditions of military service. The winter of 1863-64 was brutal, the camps poorly supplied and inadequately heated, the medical care available to conscript laborers far inferior to what officers and combat troops received. Ezekiel had developed a cough in December, had seen it worsen through January, had finally collapsed in early February and been transported to the hospital where he would spend his final days. He died on February 17, 1864, alone in a ward filled with other dying men. His final words reportedly a repetition of his wife's name that the orderly who attended him found both touching and disturbing. His body was buried in a military cemetery outside Nashville, a grave that Litty would never be able to visit, a final resting place that kept him from her even in death. Word of Ezekiel's death reached Aunt Litty in March of 1864, carried by a neighbor who had connections to the military bureaucracy and who had tracked her husband's fate through the records that the army maintained. The neighbor, a man named Ezra Combs, whose own son had been conscripted, found Litty working in the garden where Ezekiel had been taken, her hands in the same soil that his hands had worked for 47 years. The delivery of the news was one of the hardest things Combs had ever done. He approached slowly, watching Litty's face as understanding dawned. Seeing the moment when hope died and something else took its place, she did not cry, did not scream, did not show any of the grief that he had expected. She simply stood still, her hands still covered with dirt from the garden, her eyes showing an emptiness that seemed to swallow the light around her. "How?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Pneumonia," Combs replied. "At the hospital in Nashville. They said it was peaceful at the end." Litty nodded slowly as though the information was reaching her from a great distance. "He should have been here," she said. "He should have died here, with me." The news transformed something in Litty that those who knew her could observe but not quite describe, a hardening that seemed to reach into the deepest parts of her being, a coldness that replaced the warmth that had characterized her interactions with the world. She continued her healing work, continued to offer hospitality to travelers, continued to appear as the saintly figure the community had always known. But something fundamental had changed. The planning began immediately, though Litty gave no outward sign of what she was preparing. She knew that the soldiers who had taken Ezekiel were still operating in the region, still conducting conscription raids, still passing through on the road that ran beside her cabin. She knew their faces, had memorized them during the afternoon when they had taken her husband, had identified each of the 21 men who had participated in the action that had led to his death. She knew that they would eventually pass her cabin again, would eventually accept the hospitality that mountain tradition required her to offer, would eventually drink the water that she would provide. The method she chose reflected both her expertise and the constraints of her situation. She could not overpower 21 armed soldiers, could not engage them in any form of direct confrontation, but she could use the knowledge that decades of healing had provided, could prepare substances that would kill without immediate symptoms, could administer these substances through the very hospitality that the soldiers would expect her to provide. The tradition that required her to offer water to travelers would become the instrument of her revenge. The preparation of her weapon occupied the months between learning of Ezekiel's death and the opportunity to use it. She gathered plants that she had known for decades, but had never before harvested for their lethal properties, processed them into forms that could be dissolved in water without detection, calculated the doses that would be necessary to kill men who were larger and healthier than the patients she usually treated. The work was meticulous, the product of a lifetime of knowledge applied to a purpose that violated everything her healing practice had represented. The substance she prepared was derived from water hemlock, one of the most toxic plants native to the Tennessee mountains, a species that she had always warned others to avoid and that she had never before deliberately handled. The roots of water hemlock contained secutoxin, a compound that attacked the nervous system with devastating efficiency, causing convulsions and respiratory failure that could kill within hours of ingestion. The symptoms it produced could be mistaken for other conditions, the cause of death difficult to establish without knowledge that most physicians of the era did not possess. The opportunity came in June of 1865, more than a year after Ezekiel's death and 2 months after the war had officially ended, with Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The conscription raids had stopped, but the soldiers who had conducted them remained in the region as part of the occupation force that enforced federal authority during the early months of Reconstruction. Sergeant Crawford and his detachment were assigned to patrol the mountain roads, to maintain order in a region that had never accepted the authority they claimed to represent. The day that would become infamous in mountain memory was June 17th, 1865, a Saturday that dawned hot and humid in the way that Tennessee summers always did. Crawford's detachment had been patrolling since early morning, moving through the mountain roads on horseback, performing the duties that their assignment required. By midday, the heat had become oppressive, the men and their horses suffering from exertion and thirst, the need for water becoming urgent as they approached the section of road where Aunt Litty's cabin stood. Aunt Litty had been watching for them, had positioned herself on the porch of her cabin where she could observe the road, had prepared the water that she would offer with the same care she had always applied to her hospitality. The bucket that held the water appeared ordinary, the gourd dipper that she used to serve it indistinguishable from the implements that every mountain household possessed. Only Litty knew that the water contained a substance that would kill everyone who drank it, that the hospitality she was about to offer was not hospitality at all, but revenge served in a gourd dipper. Crawford saw the old woman on her porch as his detachment approached, saw the bucket that promised relief from the heat that had been tormenting them, remembered the cabin from the conscription raid nearly 2 years before, but did not remember the significance of what had happened there. He called a halt, ordered his men to dismount, led them toward the cabin where Litty waited, with an expression that Crawford interpreted as the servile hospitality that mountain people were supposed to show to their betters. "Water, ma'am," Crawford called out as he approached, the request more demand than question. The assumption that she would comply so obvious that he did not wait for an answer before directing his men toward the porch. Aunt Litty rose from her chair with the slowness of age, gathered her bucket and dipper, descended the steps to meet the soldiers who were already gathering around the well where she usually drew her water. She did not use the well that day. She used the bucket she had prepared, the water that contained the death she had been preparing for more than a year. "Hot day for riding," she said, her voice carrying the softness that age had given it, her manner showing nothing that would have suggested anything other than the hospitality that tradition required. "Let me give you all something to drink." She served them one by one, filling the gourd dipper from the bucket and offering it to each soldier in turn, watching as they drank the water that would kill them, her face showing only the gentle concern of an elderly woman caring for young men who reminded her of the sons she had raised. Some of the soldiers thanked her, their mothers having taught them manners that survived even the brutality of war. Others simply drank and moved on, accepting her service as their due without acknowledgement. All of them drank. The ritual of serving had a rhythm that Litty controlled with the patience of someone who had waited more than a year for this moment. She did not rush, did not show any sign of wanting the process to end quickly, did not betray through haste or nervousness any indication that what she was doing was anything other than the hospitality it appeared to be. Each soldier received the dipper with the same careful attention, each was served with the same measured dose, each drank without suspicion. Some of the soldiers tried to engage her in conversation as they waited their turn, asking about her life in the mountains, commenting on the heat, making the small talk that travelers made with hosts whose hospitality they were accepting. Litty responded with the brief, polite answers that such conversation required, her voice showing nothing of the fury that burned beneath her composure. She answered questions about her garden, about the weather, about the road ahead, all while counting the soldiers who had drunk and the soldiers who remained. Crawford himself was among the last to drink, the sergeant having supervised his men rather than joining them immediately. He approached Litty with the casual arrogance that had characterized his treatment of the mountain people throughout his service, accepted the dipper she offered with a nod that barely acknowledged her existence, drank deeply of the water that would end his life. "Good water," he said, handing the dipper back. "Cold for such a hot day." "Spring-fed," Litty replied, her voice carrying no trace of the satisfaction she must have felt at that moment. "It stays cold all summer." Crawford nodded and turned away, already dismissing her from his thoughts, already focused on the rest that he and his men would take before continuing their patrol. He had no reason to remember the old woman whose husband he had conscripted nearly 2 years before, no reason to connect this cabin with that afternoon, no reason to suspect that the water he had just drunk would be the last thing he ever consumed. 21 men consumed the poisoned water that afternoon, every member of the detachment including Sergeant Crawford himself. Litty served them all, measured the doses to ensure that each man received enough of the toxin to kill him, maintained her composure throughout the process, despite the knowledge of what she was doing and the memories of what these men had done to her husband. When the last soldier had drunk, when all 21 had consumed the water that would end their lives, she offered them a place to rest in the shade of the trees beside her cabin, suggested that they wait out the worst of the midday heat before continuing their patrol. The symptoms began within an hour, the cycutoxin attacking the soldiers' nervous systems with the efficiency that Litty had anticipated. The first signs were subtle, a dizziness that the men attributed to the heat, a nausea that seemed consistent with the exertion of their morning patrol. But the symptoms progressed rapidly, the dizziness becoming disorientation, the nausea becoming vomiting, the initial discomfort becoming convulsions that the men could not control and could not understand. Sergeant Crawford was among the first to collapse, his larger body having consumed more water and therefore more poison than some of his men. He fell from the tree against which he had been resting, his body seizing in spasms that threw him against the ground with a force that would have injured him even if the poison had not been killing him. His men watched in horror as their sergeant convulsed, tried to help him without understanding what was happening, found themselves beginning to experience the same symptoms that were destroying him. Within 2 hours, all 21 soldiers were dead or dying, their bodies scattered across the yard of Aunt Litty's cabin in postures that reflected the violence of their final moments. Some had died quickly, the poison overwhelming their systems before they could understand what was happening. Others had died slowly, conscious of what was happening to them, but unable to do anything to stop it, their final moments spent in a terror that Litty observed with the same stillness that had characterized her expression when the soldiers had taken her husband. The scene in the yard was one of devastation that visitors to the site would try to imagine for generations afterward. Soldiers lay where they had fallen, some alone, and some in groups where they had tried to help each other, their bodies contorted by the convulsions that the poison had produced. Horses stood confused nearby, their riders dead or dying. The animals sensing that something terrible had happened, but unable to understand what. The sounds of dying had filled the yard for nearly an hour, the moans and screams and prayers of men who knew they were being killed, but did not know why or how. Some had called for mothers, the final instinct of dying men reverting to the earliest comfort they had known. Others had called for God, their faith asserting itself in their final moments, regardless of what they had believed before. A few had called for Litty herself, had asked the old woman who sat watching them to help, to save them, to do something to stop the death that was consuming them. She had not responded to any of them. She had sat on her porch in the rocking chair where she had sat for 40 years, watching as the men died one by one, her face showing no sign of the satisfaction or horror or grief that such a scene might have produced in others. She was completing a task that had begun the day they took Ezekiel, finishing a work that had occupied her thoughts for more than a year, achieving a vengeance that would balance the scales that their actions had unbalanced. She sat on her porch throughout the afternoon, watching as the men died one by one, her face showing nothing that any observer could have read. She did not help them, did not offer the remedies that her healing knowledge might have provided, did not show any sign of the compassion that had characterized her treatment of the sick throughout her life. She simply watched, bearing witness to the deaths of the men who had killed her husband, ensuring that her revenge was complete before taking any action to address its consequences. When the last soldier had stopped moving, when all 21 lay dead in the yard that she and Ezekiel had cleared together 40 years before, Litty rose from her chair and walked among the bodies, confirming that each man was truly dead, ensuring that none had survived through some fluke of constitution or dosage. She found no survivors. The poison had done its work with the thoroughness she had planned, had killed every man who had drunk the water she had offered, had avenged Ezekiel's death in the manner she had chosen. The discovery of the bodies came the following morning, when a neighbor traveling the road passed Litty's cabin and found the yard filled with the corpses of men in Union uniforms. The neighbor, a man named Ezra Combs, who had known Litty all his life, found her sitting on her porch as though nothing unusual had occurred, her expression showing the same gentle calm that had always characterized her demeanor. She made no attempt to flee, no attempt to conceal what had happened, no attempt to create an explanation that might have deflected suspicion from herself. "What happened here, Aunt Litty?" Combs asked, his voice carrying the confusion of a man confronting something he could not understand. "They came for water," Litty replied, her voice soft and steady. "I gave them what they deserved." The admission was so direct, so devoid of any attempt at concealment, that Combs initially thought he had misunderstood. But as he looked at the bodies scattered across the yard, as he counted 21 dead soldiers and remembered the 21 men who had taken Ezekiel Whaley nearly 2 years before, he understood what had happened and what Litty was telling him. She had killed them all, had poisoned the entire detachment, had transformed the water that tradition required her to offer into an instrument of death. Combs faced a choice that would define his response to what he had witnessed. He could report what Litty had told him, could summon the authorities who would certainly arrest and probably execute her for the murder of 21 Union soldiers. Or he could protect the woman who had served his community for more than 4 decades, could help conceal the truth of what had happened, could participate in creating a story that might allow her to escape the consequences of what she had done. He chose protection as Litty had known he would, as she had counted on when she made no attempt to conceal her guilt. The community that had benefited from her healing for 40 years, that had watched helplessly as her husband was taken away to die in a war he had never supported, that shared her grief and understood her rage, would not betray her to the authorities who had caused her suffering. The wall of silence that would surround her crime was already forming before Combs left her yard. The story that emerged attributed the soldiers' deaths to contaminated water, to a natural occurrence that no one could have anticipated or prevented. The well that served Litty's cabin had been poisoned by some unknown source, perhaps a dead animal that had fallen into it and decomposed, perhaps some mineral contamination that had seeped from the surrounding rock. The soldiers had drunk the water without knowing it was dangerous, had died of natural causes that no one could have foreseen, had been victims of circumstance rather than deliberate action. The investigation that followed accepted this explanation with a readiness that reflected the investigators' desire to close the case rather than pursue its truth. The deaths of 21 soldiers was a significant incident that required official response, but the chaos of the immediate post-war period meant that thorough investigation was impossible and perhaps unwanted. The military authorities who received the report had more pressing concerns than determining the exact cause of deaths that appeared to be accidental. More important tasks than interrogating an elderly woman whose grief over her husband's death was well known. Aunt Litty was questioned, of course, her proximity to the deaths requiring at least the appearance of investigation. She repeated the story that the community had constructed, expressed sorrow for the tragedy that had occurred, offered her healing services to any soldiers who might have been exposed to the contaminated water before it claimed its victims. The investigators found nothing to contradict her account, no evidence that suggested the deaths were anything other than the accident they appeared to be. The case was closed. The deaths attributed to contaminated water, the 21 soldiers buried in a military cemetery where their graves still stand. The community's protection of Aunt Litty was absolute and permanent. No one who knew the truth ever spoke of it to anyone outside the mountain community, the secret passing from generation to generation without ever reaching authorities who might have acted on it. The silence was maintained not through threats or coercion, but through a consensus that Litty had done what justice required, that the soldiers had deserved their fate, that betraying her would be a crime worse than anything she had committed. Aunt Litty lived for another 12 years after the poisoning, dying in 1877 at the age of 79, her death coming peacefully in the cabin where she had lived most of her life, and where 21 soldiers had died in her yard. She continued her healing work until her final years, continued to care for the sick and the dying with the same devotion she had always shown, seemed to find in her remaining service a way of balancing the violence she had committed with the compassion that had characterized the rest of her life. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the mountain communities, neighbors and patients and the descendants of families she had served across 5 decades. They came to honor a woman they remembered as a healer and a saint, whose single act of violence they understood as a response to a wrong that demanded response, whose life could not be reduced to a single afternoon, no matter how terrible that afternoon had been. The preacher who delivered her eulogy spoke of her service to the community, of the lives she had saved, and the comfort she had provided, without mentioning the lives she had taken or the reasons she had taken them. Her grave lies in the church cemetery beside her husband, the two of them reunited in death after the war had separated them in life. The inscription on her stone gives no hint of what she did on that June afternoon, bearing only her name and her dates, and a phrase that the community chose to remember her by. She served her people. The words acknowledge her role as healer, without specifying the darker service she had performed, a memorial that those who know the story understand, and those who do not can interpret innocently. Ezekiel's grave beside hers bears an inscription that acknowledges his fate more directly. Taken by war, returned to peace. The words suggest the violence that ended his life without specifying its details, the conscription that separated him from his wife, the death in a military hospital that Litty had avenged with such thoroughness and such patience. The site where the soldiers died has changed little in the century and a half since that June afternoon. The cabin that Litty and Ezekiel built has been replaced by a more modern structure, but the yard where the bodies lay remains, the trees that provided shade still standing, the location still known to those who remember the story. Some visitors claim to feel something unusual at the site, a heaviness that seems to linger in places where significant violence has occurred, though such claims may reflect expectation as much as experience. The legal aftermath of the poisoning was minimal, the investigation having concluded that the deaths were accidental, and no charges having been filed against anyone. But the case became part of the folklore of the mountain communities, A story told and retold through generations, a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the people of the Hollows and the consequences of the wrongs that war inflicted upon them. The songs that emerged from the Aunt Litty story were among the most haunting in the Appalachian tradition, their melodies carrying a quality that reflected the strange mixture of hospitality and murder that characterized the events they described. The most popular ballad told the story from beginning to end, from the conscription that took Ezekiel through the poisoning that avenged his death, its verses painting a portrait of patience and determination that was both admirable and terrifying. The first verse described Aunt Litty as she had been before the war, a healer who served her community with a devotion that had made her beloved throughout the mountain region. The melody was gentle, almost a hymn, the kind of tune that might accompany a blessing or a prayer. The contrast between this gentle opening and the violence that was coming made the song particularly effective. The second verse described the conscription, the soldiers arriving at her cabin, the taking of Ezekiel despite his age and despite Litty's pleas, the moment when her life was divided into before and after. The melody shifted here, becoming minor and mournful, the notes carrying the weight of a loss that could never be repaired. The third verse described Ezekiel's death, the notification that reached Litty 6 months after his conscription, the transformation that occurred in her when she learned that her husband of 47 years would never return. This verse was brief but devastating, its melody dropping to its lowest register, suggesting a grief that words could not capture. The fourth verse described the preparation, the gathering of the poison, the planning that occupied the months between Ezekiel's death and the opportunity for revenge. The melody became almost mechanical here, the rhythm regular and relentless, suggesting the patience of a woman who could wait as long as necessary for the moment when her vengeance could be achieved. The fifth verse described the day itself, the soldiers arriving at her cabin, the offer of water that tradition required, the acceptance that the soldiers had no reason to question. The melody here was deceptively peaceful, the notes suggesting the summer day and the hospitality that concealed the death it carried. The sixth verse described the dying, the symptoms that began within an hour, the convulsions that claimed soldier after soldier, the yard filled with bodies as the afternoon wore on. This verse was the most difficult to hear, its melody becoming discordant and disturbing, the rhythm breaking down as the poison did its work. The seventh verse described Litty watching from her porch, her face showing nothing that observers could read, her silence as the men who had taken her husband died before her eyes. The melody here was simply empty, the notes sparse and hollow, suggesting the void where compassion should have been. The final verse described the aftermath, the community's protection of Litty, her remaining years of healing, her death and burial beside the husband she had avenged. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that even terrible deeds can find their proper ending, that even the most patient vengeance must eventually rest. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with a complexity that reflected the story's moral weight. There was horror at what Litty had done, the betrayal of hospitality that her method represented, the cold patience that had allowed her to wait more than a year for her opportunity. But there was also understanding of why she had done it, recognition that the war had destroyed something precious, acknowledgement that the soldiers who had taken her husband had committed a wrong that demanded response. Another song focused specifically on Ezekiel, describing his life with Litty and his death in the military hospital, portraying him as the innocent victim whose fate had provoked his wife's terrible revenge. This song was more straightforwardly mournful than the main ballad, its melody carrying the grief of a community that had watched helplessly as its men were taken away to die in a war they had never wanted. A third song told the story from the perspective of the soldiers, imagining their final hours as they realized something was wrong, as they watched their comrades die without understanding what was killing them, as they faced deaths they had never anticipated from a source they had never suspected. This song was dark and disturbing, its melody creating an atmosphere of dread that reflected the terror of men who had believed themselves safe and found themselves dying. A fourth song addressed the community's protection of Litty, celebrating the wall of silence that had prevented prosecution, portraying the conspiracy of concealment as an act of solidarity that the mountain people understood and approved. This song had an almost defiant quality, its melody suggesting pride in the community's ability to protect its own from authorities who had never deserved their cooperation. A fifth song examined the ethics of what Litty had done, asking questions about hospitality and betrayal, about the sanctity of traditions that had sustained the mountain communities for generations, about whether the violation of those traditions could ever be justified, regardless of the provocation. This song offered no answers, only questions that listeners were invited to consider, its melody remaining unresolved through its final verse. The historians who have studied the Aunt Litty case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to Union occupation, arguing that the poisoning represented a response to the broader pattern of abuse that characterized federal treatment of the Tennessee mountains during and after the war. The conscription of Ezekiel Whaley was not an isolated incident, but was part of a systematic exploitation of mountain communities that had given their people ample reason to hate the soldiers who claimed to represent legitimate authority. Others have focused on the gender dynamics of the case, noting that Litty's success depended on assumptions about elderly women that the soldiers never thought to question. The tradition of hospitality that she exploited required that she offer water to travelers, but it also required that travelers accept what she offered without suspicion. The soldiers who drank her water never imagined that a grandmother could be an enemy, never considered that the cup she handed them might contain their death. The medical analysis has examined the choice of water hemlock as the poison, noting that cicutoxin was one of the most effective natural poisons available in the Tennessee mountains. The symptoms it produced could be mistaken for other conditions, the cause of death difficult to establish without specialized knowledge. Litty's choice of poison reflected a sophistication that came from decades of working with plants and their properties. The botanical analysis has examined the availability of water hemlock in the Tennessee mountains during the period of Litty's preparation. The plant grows in wet areas throughout the Appalachian region, its distinctive white flowers and purple-streaked stems making it identifiable to those who know what to look for. Litty would have known where to find it, would have understood the dangers of handling it, would have processed it with the care that such a deadly substance required. The toxicological analysis has attempted to reconstruct the doses that Litty administered, estimating from the symptoms described and the timeline of deaths how much cicutoxin each soldier likely consumed. The calculations suggest that she prepared her poison with precision, that each soldier received enough toxin to kill him without any margin for error, that she understood exactly what she was doing and did it exactly right. The psychological analysis has examined Litty's state of mind, noting that the year-long delay between learning of Ezekiel's death and carrying out her revenge suggested a patience that went beyond ordinary grief. She had not acted in the heat of passion, but had planned and prepared with a deliberation that required sustained emotional control. The ability to maintain her composure while serving death to 21 men suggested a psychological discipline that few people possess. The grief analysis has examined how Litty's loss of Ezekiel might have affected her capacity for the kind of cold calculation that her plan required. Some psychologists have suggested that profound grief can produce a detachment from ordinary moral constraints, a sense that the world has already ended and that nothing one does can make it worse. Others have suggested that Litty's actions reflected not detachment but hyper-engagement, a focus on the goal of vengeance that gave her life meaning during a period when everything else had been taken from her. The sociological analysis has examined the community's role in protecting Litty, noting that the conspiracy of silence required coordination among dozens of people, who all chose to protect her rather than cooperate with authorities. The community's solidarity reflected shared values about justice and about the wrongs that the war had inflicted, a consensus that Litty had done what needed to be done and deserved protection from the consequences. The military analysis has examined the security failures that allowed the poisoning to occur, noting that the soldiers had no protocols for protecting themselves against threats that came from sources they considered harmless. The assumption that an elderly woman posed no danger was so deeply embedded in military culture that no precautions against such threats existed. The case demonstrated that the most dangerous enemies were sometimes the ones who appeared least threatening. The religious analysis has examined the role of faith in shaping both Litty's actions and the community's response to them. The mountain communities were deeply religious, their Christianity emphasizing both forgiveness and justice in ways that created space for interpreting Litty's actions as divinely sanctioned. Some in the community believed that God had used Litty as an instrument of punishment, that the soldiers' deaths were divine justice administered through human hands. You see, what Aunt Litty did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 21 men through poison, used the sacred tradition of hospitality as her weapon, betrayed the trust that travelers placed in hosts in ways that violated principles the mountain communities had honored for generations. The fact that her victims had participated in her husband's conscription does not eliminate the fact that she took 21 human lives in response to one. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Her husband had been taken from her by soldiers who had no legal right to conscript him, had been worked to death in a war he had never supported, had died alone in a military hospital while she waited at home for news that would destroy her. The system that should have protected Ezekiel had instead killed him, and the system that should have punished those responsible would never even acknowledge that a wrong had been committed. The story challenges us to consider the meaning of hospitality when it is demanded by those who have earned only hostility. The tradition that required Litty to offer water to travelers assumed that travelers came in peace, that the obligations of host to guest existed within a framework of mutual respect that the war had destroyed. When soldiers who had taken her husband came to her door expecting the hospitality they had forfeited, Litty gave them what the tradition required while transforming its meaning into something the tradition had never anticipated. The question of proportionality haunts this story, as it haunts all such narratives. 1 man conscripted and dead, 21 men poisoned in response. Was the response proportionate? The answer depends on what we believe Ezekiel represented and what his conscription signified. If he was merely an individual whose death was tragic, but whose life was not worth more than any other, then the response was wildly disproportionate. If he represented something larger, the community's vulnerability to a government that viewed them as resources to be exploited, the destruction of a marriage that had lasted 47 years, the violation of everything that made mountain life meaningful, then the question becomes more complex. The hospitality that Litty corrupted was not merely a social convention, but was a fundamental principle of mountain life, a tradition that had allowed isolated communities to survive by ensuring that travelers could move through the region safely. By transforming hospitality into murder, Litty violated a trust that went beyond her individual relationship with the soldiers she killed, raised questions about whether any traveler could trust any host, about whether the traditions that had sustained the community could survive their use as instruments of death. The descendants of those who knew Aunt Litty still live in the mountains of East Tennessee, carrying memories passed down through generations about what their ancestor did and why. Family stories speak of her with a mixture of reverence and unease, acknowledging both her decades of healing and her single terrible act of vengeance. She is remembered as proof that the gentlest exteriors can conceal the hardest cause, that those who serve others most faithfully may be the most dangerous when that service is betrayed. The graves where Aunt Litty and Ezekiel rest are still maintained, still visited by those who know their story, still marked by the stones that give no hint of what Litty did on that June afternoon. The cemetery is small and peaceful, shaded by trees that have grown for generations, a place that carries no obvious sign of the violence that makes it significant to those who know. The military cemetery where the soldiers are buried lies miles from Litty's grave, in a place where rows of identical stones mark the final resting places of men who died in the war and its aftermath. Their stones give no indication of how they died, record only their names and ranks and the dates of their deaths, make them indistinguishable from the thousands of other soldiers who lie in similar cemeteries throughout the former Confederacy. Some of them have descendants who occasionally visit, who wonder about the ancestor whose death was recorded as accidental, who have no reason to suspect that the water he drank on a hot June day was anything other than the refreshment it appeared to be. The story of Aunt Litty endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love that survives death, of a woman whose devotion to her husband was so complete that his murder demanded a response regardless of the cost. It is the story of patience that serves vengeance, of more than a year of preparation that culminated in a single afternoon of death. It is the story of hospitality betrayed, of traditions used as weapons, of the transformation of kindness into killing. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at Aunt Litty's grave, to read the inscription that promises she served her people, to contemplate the life of a woman who healed for decades and killed in an afternoon? Would you visit the military cemetery where the soldiers rest? Would you walk among the stones that mark the graves of men who died, not knowing why? Would you try to understand how an old woman's grief became their death? The journey to Cock County is easier now than it was in 1865, the roads paved and the connections to the outside world more numerous than they were when Aunt Litty Whaley offered water to soldiers who had taken her husband. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of healers and killers rest in those mountains, sometimes the same person, their stories intertwined in ways that refuse to be untangled. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. The story of Aunt Litty has been told and retold through generations, passed from parent to child, sung in ballads that still bring shivers to those who hear them. It is a story about what happens when war destroys the innocent, when grief transforms into fury, when the gentlest traditions become the deadliest weapons. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about hospitality and betrayal, about patience and vengeance, about what we would do if soldiers came and took the person we loved most and left us with nothing but time to plan our response. And that, my friend, is the true story of Aunt Litty, who poisoned 21 soldiers with glasses of water after they took her husband to a war that killed him, who waited more than a year for her opportunity, who used the tradition of hospitality as her weapon and the summer heat as her accomplice, who watched from her porch as the men who had destroyed her life died one by one in her yard. A story of patience and poison, of grief and vengeance, of a woman who served her community for 40 years and then served her husband's memory in a single terrible afternoon. The mountains remember, and through them so do we all.